This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1052, a conversation with Ron Frenz.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. This is episode 1052. This is Adam Chapman, your host, and today we're having a conversation with Ron Frenz. It's not just any conversation with Ron Frenz. We're also doing a bit of a creator commentary, as we're specifically talking about 2 issues of Untold Tales of Spider-Man that he did. It's always a pleasure to have Ron on the show. He's a great friend of the show. He's always been so generous with his time and his insights, so I'm always a big fan of any episode when I can have Ron on to talk about the comics he's done. We'll do another creator commentary soon. I think we're going to be talking about his Hercules miniseries in the mid to late 90s at that point. But in this particular one, we're talking about 2 issues of Untold Tales of Spider-Man, issue, I believe, 9 and issue 25. So this was a fun one. It's always fun with Ron. If you want to check out his prior appearances on the show, you better strap in because there's a number of them. We have episode 296, 408, 734, 744, 748, 776, 886, 920, 980, 1000, and 1004. I believe this is the 13th time he's been on the show. It's lucky 13. And this was another great conversation with Ron. You can email me at comicshenanigans@gmail.com. Rate the show on Apple Podcasts. Listen to us on Apple Podcasts. And also listen to us on Spotify. Thanks so much for downloading. And let's get right into the episode as I sit down with Ron Frenz to talk about his work on 2 issues of Untold Tales of Spider-Man. Enjoy. Ron, welcome back to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing fine, Adam, and it is always a pleasure to join you on the Shenanigans podcast.
The pleasure is always mine. So last time, it's funny, I had given you a list of things I was hoping to do a creator commentary on, and in true Adam and Ron fashion, we talked about 2 of the issues, and that was it. So this is the follow-up where we're going to delve a little bit into Untold Tales of Spider-Man, specifically issues 9 and 25. So this would have been from the mid-90s. So I have a lot of questions just to place this in terms of context, because was this the time when you and Pat Olive shared a studio, or am I thinking differently?
It would have been during that time. That is correct.
Okay, so I'm curious, like, he does almost every issue in the run. I think he does all 23 except the 2 that you do. So was that, from your recollection, was that, a deadline thing and you kind of jumped in as the guest artist, or how did this kind of come about, especially the first time where you're doing issue number 9?
Well, Pat was never late. He is a machine. So I think there was some consideration about giving him some lead time on the next issues. I believe that was the only consideration in this case. It wasn't if it was a scheduling issue at all, it was a deliberate attempt to just let him skip ahead and jump onto the next one. Because working with Kurt Busiek, they both tended to be machines and to be hitting everything on the money. I will disagree with you, though. I think there was at least one other issue I remember towards the end of the run. I believe it had Batwing in it, and I think it was just done by Bob McLeod.
Oh, okay.
But I don't have what I have in front of me is just the one trade paperback that was just the Untold Tales of Spider-Man Volume 1. So I actually am going to be going completely from memory for the final issue that I worked on.
Okay.
But I do have the Lizard issue in front of me. So
interesting. Yeah, you know what? Now that you say it, I think you are right. I think maybe that second last issue was not by Pat either. So I'm curious, was it a natural kind of call for them to kind of reach out to you because you guys are studio mates and your styles are not totally dissimilar from each other? Or like, why do you think you got the gig to kind of jump in and do the fill-in?
It is never a given for me to be called in. It was not a given that that when Pat was going to leave Spider-Girl towards the end, that they would give it to me to steer into the dock, basically, because we initially we only thought we were, bringing it into port after Pat took another assignment, thinking that we were wrapping up with issue 60. So this was very much the same type of thing. I never assumed that anybody was, going to reach out to me or anything. I was thrilled that they did. I don't know whether Pat had a direct hand in suggesting me or anything to editor Tom Brevoort and Bob Harris. Yeah, Brevoort was the line editor and Bob Harris was the editor-in-chief. If I remember correctly, this might have been post my Superman run. I might have been at loose ends at this point. So I was eager to, make some hay over at Marvel again and let them know I was still alive and such. But I don't, I'm not really good with dates and everything, so I might be talking out my nose here, to tell you the truth. I don't know where it all fit in the overall scheme of things, but it was never a given that because Pat was doing it and they knew I shared studio space or anything like that. So I was just thrilled that they did. Possibly Pat had a hand in it. And it was, for me, Pat did the cover to it. It was very much, understood that I was just coming in to do one issue and to give him some breathing space to jump onto the next one. So, it was, it was a terrific opportunity for me to get back into Spider-Man a little bit, and I certainly was familiar with the era and familiar with the characters. Other than Batwing, I made some mistakes on Batwing's head structure and stuff that I just wasn't paying attention to the reference enough. I tried to rectify that when I got to handle Batwing again in the Spider-Girl run, late Spider-Girl run. But that was just me being an idiot. And Pat being too nice to correct me, or he didn't notice it either, one or the other. Probably came through the office pretty quickly. But I enjoyed doing the Lizard. I never got to do the Lizard during my run on Spider-Man. We didn't do any of the classic villains during my run. So I was thrilled to get a chance to do the Lizard. And everybody, I'll address this up front, because everybody assumes that I do the Lizard off of the 67 cartoon. And I don't really. What they're noticing is something that I noticed, is that the simplification of the Lizard on the 67 cartoon is based directly off of Ditko's Lizard.
Absolutely.
If you look at the original Lizard story by Ditko, what they did on the 67 cartoon is an animated simplification of the structure of the head and everything, and I thought they did a wonderful job making it animatable and giving it a lot of wonderful movement. But it's Ditko's Lizard without all the Ditko detail on it. And so, yes, I used that to kind of get a handle on what Ditko's structure was to the head and everything, which was quite a bit different from what Romita did with the character, when he first handled the character early in his run. So, so they're not wrong in relating it to the cartoon, but I think they're missing the direct connection between the 67 cartoon and Ditko. So it really was, for me, as much a return to Ditko as it was homaging the original animated series.
It's funny you mention that, because last night I was reading some of the original Ditko stuff with my son, so we actually read that Lizard issue, and then this morning I was like, I don't think my son remembers me ever showing him the 67 animated series, because I do have it on DVD that I bought 2 decades ago. So I put that on for him and my daughter, and it struck me the same way, that that's definitely what he's doing. What the animated version was doing was just that simplification, and even the storytelling was very similar. So it was interesting to kind of see that, and hearing you describe it, I'm like, I just saw this, so yes.
Well, I'm glad. See, now there's little things like that I'm happy to throw in there as far as some of my references and stuff. I've spoken on my Facebook page quite often about how cartoon-addled my brain is and how many of those early cartoons from the mid to late 60s, for me, are completely laser-beamed into my frontal lobe. They're very, very early, very protean memories that are burned into my brain that led to my love of Into the Comics and certainly the characters. So, I bought a DVD of the old 60s Aquaman cartoon, the Filmation Aquaman cartoon.
Oh, yeah.
And none of the other episodes have the same effect, but the pilot episode, the very first episode, as I watched it again all these years later, I mean, we're talking 50-some years later, just came roaring back into that, unused section of my brain, and I was saying the dialogue ahead of the cartoon. It was incredible. And you were talking about a time when you saw reruns, but beyond that, you weren't watching it, on a loop the way kids can their favorite cartoons these days, So it's really amazing to me how much certain memories of those cartoons in that time really imprinted on me. It's really incredible. I mean, but there were certain shots and bits of dialogue and bits of the action from that first episode that made an incredible impression on me. I can very clearly remember holding the art on those Filmation cartoons up to as a standard of something like, oh my gosh, someday I want to be able to draw like that. I want to be able to draw that well, and making that kind of a goal and a level of achievement that I was striving for. Mm-hmm. So I was a big fan of that stuff. That really got me into. Of course, at the time, the Aquaman comic was Nick Carty, and that Nick Carty art was just incredible. I mean, but the cartoons led me to that. I remember at the time they were running a tagline above the Aquaman logo that said "King of the Sea and TV." And as a kid, it was just a beautiful crossover for me, and I loved Aquaman at that point, and that led me to Nick Carty, which led me into all kinds of different levels of art and things for me to achieve that I'm still working at to this day. So,
have you drawn? I mean, besides commissions, have you drawn Aquaman professionally?
I don't think so. Other than for Warner Brothers consumer products for their merchandising end, I've done some Aquaman shots. But no, I don't believe I've ever done him as far as story content. I'm trying to think if he ever cameoed in a Superman or something, but I don't believe he did. I don't think any of the stuff. I don't think I've had the opportunity. No, and there have been so many different versions of him as well. So,
oh, for sure.
But it is a character that I enjoy, and if anybody's moved to do it, if you go to my Facebook page and hit the search bar and put in Friends Aquaman, there'll be some drawings that I've done of him for commissions and things I've played with idly with redesigns and things that, if I ever did get a chance to play with Aquaman, what I might do, and, little things where, we're fans too, so we indulge in fan fiction the same way everybody does,
So a few things just to point out, because I did double check. So it was McLeod who did issue 24 of Untold Tales of Spider-Man.
Okay.
So I am suitably corrected. I did also check the timeline as to when Untold Tales of Spider-Man number 9 came out. So it actually would have gone on sale after, I believe, your 6th issue of Superman would have come out.
Okay.
So just kind of in the middle of your Superman run.
There were a couple of times that I asked for dispensation from my Superman contract to do a couple of quick jobs for Marvel. I know Spider-Girl happened towards the tail end. What If 105 happened towards the tail end of my run, so that when the Superman job went away, it was right around the time that they were interested in, taking Spider-Girl and rolling it into the MC2 line, which gave me somewhere to go and land back at Marvel with Tom DeFalco again, which was a joy, of course.
Of course. It's interesting from a timeline perspective because I always like to see what's kind of happening at the same time. So, you're doing Untold Tales of Spider-Man, you're the regular artist on Superman. A couple months go by, you do your work on the Amazing Spider-Man 96 annual that we've talked about before. That's always been a favorite of mine. A few months later, you have the Superman Wedding album comes out I think it's maybe a few weeks apart from Hobgoblin Lives coming out. So a lot of big stuff happening all around that period.
It was a wonderfully fulfilling, busy time. Yeah, it made you always had to be careful. You always had to listen to the Han Solo in your head. Don't get cocky, because every time you thought, "Oh, this is never going to end," it does. So it was an interesting time, and certainly, Pat Olive will talk about the fact that. One of his favorite aspects of us sharing studio space was that at one time there was this nondescript studio in Bellevue, Pennsylvania, that out of which was coming Untold Tales of Spider-Man and Superman. At the same time. From these two knuckleheads sitting at their drawing tables in this nondescript studio, so it was a wonderfully creative time for us individually and collectively, because as I've always said, sharing studio space with Pat, it was a wonderful experience for me, having worked for years in private and alone. In isolation, basically. So having another creative there to bounce things off of and whose work can inspire, it was terrific. It was wonderful. The few times we got to work together to the capacity where he would ink me, the times where we would work back and forth on Hobgoblin Lives. He actually tightened up some pencils on, I believe, issue 2 of that to help me out, because the schedule was getting a little tight with my Superman commitments and everything. So it was an interesting time, and it was a time I really valued, of actually being in a studio environment with another creative that I respected as much as Pat, and he claims to feel the same way. I find that hard to believe, because I've always classified myself very much as a cartoonist, and Pat very, very much as a very well-rounded illustrator. And I've always admired his ability, storytelling and illustrative. And I do see him as being a level above me in intent and artistic acumen and ability. But that's just that's just how I look at it internally.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious. So, well, first of all, the idea that you have two creatives sharing space, and that they kind of generally feed off each other's energy and start to get better. I remember talking to people who were part of the cross-gen experiment, and a lot of the artists have said that they came out much better than they went in, because you were working with all these other artists in an office, which was unusual and not something you would have seen outside of a studio environment, which a lot of people didn't necessarily work under. So suddenly they were working with the inkers and the colorists, and all these people were kind of together and being able to pick up a lot of things that they may not have been able to pick up on their own and get better from the experience. That's number one.
I completely agree with that. As long as you're in an environment where you're able to appreciate, put your ego aside and appreciate what somebody else brings to the table, and hopefully respect what they're contributing, is always an important aspect of it. But luckily that was that was not an issue with Pat. I unabashedly respected what he was producing, and he claims to feel the same way. So the back and forth was, very open, and we felt very comfortable critiquing each other's work when critique was necessary. And the one little thing I think I contributed is when I went from doing Spider-Man to doing the Kirby characters of Thor. Mm-hmm. I went through a phase, and I always hate to point this out because I hate the idea of people going back and noticing it if they didn't the first time. But if you look at some of my early Thors, some of the figures have a tendency to have little pinheads because I was consciously trying to bulk up my figure work because my Spider-Man was based in Ditko, and Spider-Man was a leaner character and was not, the 6'6" Kirby stature godlike figures of Thor. So when I moved over to Thor, it was my agenda was to bulk up my figures and make them prouder and stand more Kirby-like and all of that. And in the process of doing that, the figures became more important than the proportion to the head. And there were these shots of tiny little pinheads that Brett Breeding would help adjust at times, but even he missed it every once in a while. And when Pat went from Untold Tales of Spider-Man to working on Thor Core and Tales of Asgard and things like that, Tales of Asgard, of course, came before Untold Tales of Spider-Man. But I believe one of the next projects after Untold Tales for him was Thor Core. And he went through that phase. I noticed as he was adjusting to doing the larger, more dynamic characters in a slightly different way. They were dynamic in a different way than Spider-Man. That he was starting to do it too. And because of my experience with it and looking, being able to look back on, seeing it objectively for what it was and realizing that, oops, it happened, I was able to notice it on his pencils and point it out to him. So his phase of that was much shorter. His window was much shorter in his adjustment phase than mine was. And I always felt very gratified that I was able to, prevent that for somebody else. Since it seems like it might be something that just is part of that adjustment, is part of that going from the intimacy of a 9-panel Ditko world to the Panavision of a double-page splash Kirby world, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It just seems to be part of the adjustment in lenses, if you want to look at it in filmmaking terms. And it was fascinating, and I was happy that I could be there to point it out to him so that he wouldn't have to discover it on his own or work his way out of it the way I did. So that was, I always can look back on that and feel like that was some function I served for Pat as part of our time in the studio together.
So, and a kind of a follow-up to the idea of you guys sharing a studio, and I promise we'll actually talk about Untold Tales of Spider-Man at one point.
Okay, I believe you.
But I don't know if you've told me before, or if you have, I may have forgotten, and I apologize. What actually was the genesis behind you guys deciding to share studio space to begin with? Because as you said, you'd been an established artist for quite some time, and you had kind of worked privately, on your own. So what led to this discovery or discussion with Pat about let's have a studio space together?
We had met. We had. We had known each other for years. I had some small role in getting him Tales of Asgard, getting him the first Tales of Asgard that he did. It was from a story that I had plotted and suggested Pat for, and Ralph Macchio was very open to those kinds of suggestions and taking a shot at new talent. So, I was a big fan of his work, and we were living in fairly close proximity to each other, so we would get together for lunches, and it became a natural conversation because we had both been curious about the idea. He was working from home, I was working from home. You always have. I know I've always been curious of the early days of comics, where studios were more part of the natural order, and it was just something we started to chat about. And first it was, we should think about that. Yeah, we should. And then we actually did start thinking about it. At the time, I was actually involved with someone out in Las Vegas in a long-distance relationship, and so I hesitated to pull the trigger on it because I didn't know how much longer I was going to be here. Unfortunately, when that relationship ended, I was able to, basically contact Pat in the aftermath of that during my recovery and say, if you're still interested, we can start looking for a place, And so we did. We looked at a few different locations in this small town area that I live in called Bellevue that has always been an interesting place to live when you're working with people from New York. If you've ever watched the old Barney Miller series, they would reference Bellevue quite a bit as the hospital for the insane.
Oh, yeah.
It's a psychiatric hospital in New York, apparently, that it's fairly well known. So if you worked for Marvel and said you lived in Bellevue, they got a big kick out of that. So anyway, we started looking at a couple of different rental properties, and we found a nice little storefront, nice nondescript little storefront. It's only like 2 blocks from where I live, and it was a short drive for Pat, and it gave us a place to get away from, so we could leave work at the studio and clear it out of our homes, that kind of thing. And it went really, it went incredibly well. I mean, we did work different schedules for a large portion of the time we were there, when we weren't, working some crazy deadline or something like on Revenge of the Green Goblin or something like that. And Revenge of the Green Goblin, I think, even happened after Pat had moved out of the studio. And the reason he moved out was not a clash of personalities or anything. It was his wife chose to start her own business, and until she was up and running, money was more of an issue, and he didn't want to share studio space without contributing his fair share. So he was going to move back home and take care of business from there, and while she took her shot and started her own business. So I mean, it was no hard feelings. I wasn't sure I was going to keep the studio for myself, but financially it was possible, and the idea of moving back was exhausting. So I, to this day, still keep the studio space. And when Pat and I do spend time together, we just spent time together a couple of weekends ago at the North Carolina Heroes Aren't Hard to Find convention. And we drove the 7 hours down and 7 hours back together. And I've always quick to tell him that if he ever has a desire to move back, arrangements can be made, that kind of thing. But I think he's very happy where he's set up right now at home, and it enabled him to, have a real hand in raising his daughter, who is now a teenager. And so, I mean, it's been wonderful for him. I'm very happy for him, and the work he's doing now is just incredible. He has started to do things digitally, and you really can't tell the difference. I mean, he's able to produce a little faster digitally, and it's every bit as good as producing on paper. Unfortunately, there's not going to be the after art market, but as far as the storytelling goes and the actual work, it's stunning. I don't know if you're Well, I think you've interviewed him about some of the stuff he's been doing.
Oh yeah, no, I've been keeping track because his creator owned stuff,
World and Rough Riders and projects like that are just incredible stuff.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
I haven't gotten to see Tormented yet because I don't read comics online or follow the digital world much. But as soon as it's printed, you can bet I'll be grabbing a copy. So.
He's doing some great stuff there. I can personally attest to that.
Yep.
So let's talk about Untold Tales of Spider-Man. So
okay, let's get back to it. I promise we'll keep each other on point.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
So you get this gig, and so you're working with Kurt, and I'm curious, Kurt of the time, like, do you recall how detailed were these scripts? Because, and obviously he had established at this point a bit of a, he'd done 8 issues with Pat, so I'd imagine there's a bit of give and take there, kind of knowing what he's getting, but now you're a guest artist, so I'm curious how he approached the script for you.
I don't know if he knew he was plotting for me. Okay. There was the next plot. I don't remember anything being directly, it's possible there were even some lines in there that were directed completely at Pat. I don't know. But in those cases, I don't think this was, plotted with him knowing that I was going to be doing it or caring that I was going to be doing it. So I just remember it as being a very traditional Marvel plot, which I am incredibly comfortable with. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a nice, well-done classic Marvel comic with all the incumbent, character dynamics and character development that I have always enjoyed working with DeFalco, and I thought it was a script and plot, and I really enjoyed it. I hope I served it well. I never got a call from him saying he was unhappy with it, so I'm going to go ahead and say that Kurt was very happy with what I did, but who the devil knows?
So
you do your best and hope for the best.
Absolutely. Now, it's interesting because obviously we've talked a lot in the past about obviously how much Ditko really looms large for you when it comes to Spider-Man. Romita obviously as well, but especially when you first started drawing Spider-Man, you definitely had this more of a Ditko channeling, and now you're actually working on a book that's set within the raindrops of the Ditko universe, so it's not just something that'd be nice to do, it's more encouraged to really fit into the Ditko mold because these stories are taking place at that time. Did that to you feel like, yes, I can really sink my teeth into really channeling the Ditko influence in a more overt way?
To be perfectly honest, no, because I was so thrilled to be, to stick a toe back in the Marvel world that I don't really feel I went even as heavily Ditko as I did, even like in The Kid Who Collects Spider-Man or the What If that I did or anything. Some of my natural Buscema-ish kind of came out. The characters themselves, I wanted to match the Ditko aesthetic that Pat was doing with the characters and everything. But when it came to the Spider-Man figure, there are times when I think I actually made him a little too muscular, having a little bit of trouble separating it from the Superman stuff. And I don't really think I went overtly Ditko. I think I was kind of letting my Sal Buscema, John Buscema freak flag fly a little bit. I think I was embracing some of the traditional Marvel action stuff a little bit more than I was worried about the specific Ditko. Because, Pat had kind of set a standard where he never in the entire run did a Ditko lift. He never tried to do Ditko. He designed all the characters off the Ditko model, but he was very much doing his versions of the characters. And unlike my time on Spider-Man, he was never doing any kind of lifts or homages or anything. He had just kind of created his own aesthetic that was based on the Ditko. And I think I was trying to use that model to some degree. But as I look at the action sequences and stuff, I mean, I could have gone a lot more Ditko with the details, and I don't remember ever looking like what issues this fell between or where we would be even Ditko's evolution of Spider-Man or anything like that. I was mostly just, trying not to go too far afield from what Pat was establishing as his own aesthetic on the book. And, it's up to the readers as to how well I succeeded or failed. So.
I do. I've always really loved your opening splash with the lizard kind of grabbing Spider-Man and jumping out the window, especially because there's something about... It's interesting hearing you talk about how you drew Spider-Man's musculature throughout the issue, and then looking at it, and it's interesting because I can kind of start to see what you're talking about, that some parts made him look a little bit thicker and a little bit more adult and maybe a little less on the young side. But on this opening splash, he does feel much younger and smaller in an appropriate way, which I really enjoyed. So I feel like if you're worried about how you were able to kind of make Peter look younger and maybe not as built, I think it works in the opening splash.
Well, I appreciate that. The one shot I was looking at was later in the comic, when there's like this half splash of Spider-Man and Batwing, and it looks very, it's very much in the Buscema realm, and his muscles are a little, he's a little thicker, a little more adult, and you're right. I mean, that's the problem with that, is that Pat was very much keeping him a teen, and the head to body ratio, the head was a little bigger and all that kind of stuff, and I don't feel that I really nailed that as part of what I was doing. I think I was caught up a little bit more in kind of doing a more current Spider-Man than I probably should have, but none of us are perfect, and as you get caught up in trying to serve the story and enjoying yourself, sometimes you lose a little bit of the, you let your eye shift off the prize a little bit, unfortunately.
I'm curious, and this is such a weird little detail, but something I've talked with Pat a lot over the years is when he's using characters, there's something about how Pat does clothing that I always found very, very interesting, especially in his more recent projects where it's become more of an important feature of the characters he's designed, where they have very specific clothing patterns, etc., and he really is able to kind of make those clothing speak. I'm curious about how you felt you portrayed Peter in the classic blue suit. That he did a great job of illustrating throughout Untold Tales. Obviously, he didn't pioneer that look, but I'm curious how you felt kind of drawing Spider-Man looking like this, because I feel like, and maybe I'm just projecting here, but I feel like because you are drawing a Peter who's wearing a certain attire and kind of comporting himself in a different way, I feel like it did channel more of that Ditko feel just because of what you have him wearing. Whereas when you were drawing Spider-Man, he was obviously wearing more period-appropriate clothes and more contemporary, but this feels more of a throwback, and I think it does manage to channel that Ditko in a different way.
Oh, I'm very happy with my portrayal of Pete as I look back on these pages. I enjoyed doing Aunt May again, and Pete in the suit, I think, is something that I was a little more successful in matching what Pat was doing in the book at the time, and I think you're right. I think I was able to better capture the Ditko aesthetic of Pete in his shirt and tie and suit and everything a little better than I was the Spider-Man. I think I got a little, I was indulging a little too much. I was indulging myself on the Spider-Man figures a little too much, and kind of losing the point of that. But I think with Pete and the other teenagers in the scenes, because I really enjoyed doing Sally. I find short hair very attractive on women, and the way Pat had designed the character and everything appealed to me. So I was happy to do the brief scene with Sally, and setting up some of the stuff that they were going to be doing with Bluebird later on. Mm-hmm. But yeah, overall, I mean, I don't think it's a bad job. I never got notes from anybody saying that I, blew the Spider-Man stuff or anything. But, as I look back on it now, I could have done more to match what Pat was doing from issue to issue. So sometimes we get caught up in a little too much self-indulgence. What can I tell you?
There's one thing that I really like, but at the same time, I recognize that it's not necessarily on model, and I'm curious about it, is that I think the second last page of the issue, you have a shot of Peter in his room, and he's wearing the Spider-Man outfit, but he doesn't have the mask on, and you have the shot of his face, and just the way that you do his hair, it feels very of the Romita style, yet throughout the issue, you had him with a much more close-cropped, Ditko haircut. So it was the only part that I thought, I don't know if that's on model, but at the same time, I love the interpretation. Like, the way you have Peter's face, like, that's... He looks like Peter. It looks very identifiable as that's the character, even if he wasn't wearing the costume. But it just was interesting because it's technically not the same as he looked the rest of the issue, but from a more modern perspective at the time, that's definitely what Peter looked like.
Well, I do see him as being, as Pete, as being he was very well kept in an almost nerdish way because he wore a shirt and tie when nobody else was and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But I have seen people having worn that mask, and the first thing you do when you take that mask off from personal experience is you put your hand up in your hair and you scruff it. Because your head has been squeezed by the mask. So, anytime I draw Pete pulling off his mask, the few times in my run that I drew Pete in the costume with the mask off, his hair is a mess because that's the first thing you do, is you put your hand up and you scruff your hair. Pete tends to look un-Ditko in those kinds of situations. There are scenes that Ditko did where Pete's hair was more mussed than others. I don't think he ever went into the Romita range with it, but he's not as well kept. So I could see where it starts to cross some lines into Romita. I did a what if story that in the course of the what if tale that they were telling, they went from the Ditko era into the Romita era. And I don't know if the inker on the job, Sam De La Rosa, was quite on page with what I was trying to communicate, but he did a terrific job overall. But he kind of tied it all together a little bit more than I was hoping the inker would, because I was definitely trying to recognize in the artwork the transition between Ditko and Romita for the purposes of the context of the story. So in my pencils, the difference between the Ditko and the Romita pages are a little more obvious than after they were inked in the consistent style of the inker of Mr. De La Rosa. Mm-hmm. So it's still there for people to notice. I've still gotten comments from people who did notice what I was trying to do, but at the same time, I only bring that up to tell you that I'm very aware of the similarities and the differences between the Ditko approach and the Romita approach to the characters, and quite often in what I try to do is find some amalgam of the two approaches and try to bring them together. People have seen it in some of my commissions and things, and have referenced, have called me the love child of Ditko and Romita in trying to bring those two elements of the two styles into, a single version of Spider-Man that kind of combines elements of both. And that's my happy space. My happy space is when I can take Romita dynamics and pair them with some of the Ditko aesthetic to get a Spider-Man that kind of touches on both. And I've done it a handful of times to my own satisfaction, and it's always gratifying when people see what I'm attempting anyway. So.
You mentioned something earlier about have more of a Buscema influence at times, or at least that you can kind of see it more in your work. I'm curious about one moment in particular. You have the lizard kind of using his tail to kind of whap Spider-Man away from him, and it feels like one of those classic Sal Buscema giant punch moments.
Oh yeah, that definitely was much more inspired by Sal. I have if I'm said to have a natural style, my natural style is not Ditko, and it's really not Kirby. It's elements of those. It's things I've learned from studying both Ditko and Kirby. Mm-hmm. But left to my own devices, I think my natural style is more in the realm of, so it sits somewhere in the lost Buscema brother and the adopted but neglected Ramita son. That's definitely more the wheelhouse that is when left to my own devices. If somebody just said, draw this character or create this character, that tends to be more, if I have a natural style, it's more the Buscema Ramita influence that comes out. Mm-hmm. Because that was really what pulled me into, as I started to really think, I want to do this someday as a profession. It was illustrators like Sal Buscema and John Buscema and John Romita that really pulled me in that direction. Mm-hmm. And even Rich Buckler and a lot of his work before he started doing his Kirby pastiche on Fantastic Four, he was also very much of that school. It's a very direct, dynamic, well-drawn figures to the best of your ability, with clean, realistic but simplified anatomy, things like that doesn't involve the Kirby veneer or the Ditko veneer. Those things are very character specific for me. But the dynamics of what I try to do on any kind of regular basis comes very much from the Buscema school and the Ramita school, which it has its roots in Kirby and Ditko, and it's certainly its storytelling roots and all of that. But but left to my natural style, I would say it leans more Buscema or Ramita. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is what comes out in these action sequences. Absolutely. Yeah.
One thing I really found striking about some of the artistic choices you made was near the end when you have the transformation scene of the lizard turning back into Kurt Connors, and even actually earlier in the issue when you have Connors turning into Lizard. But there's just something specifically about the second time when you have him turning back into Kurt, that how you draw that out, and you have the different kind of images as the pain the lizard feels, but then the elation that Kurt Connors feels when he's kind of restored, is really something. It's great storytelling. Even the page before where he starts to kind of change, and you have this kind of angry, incensed lizard phase, and he starts to be in pain and realizing that he's losing control and he's going to turn back into Kurt. So I just wanted to mention that because I thought it was just a striking sequence of images.
Thank you. The panel, the transformation panel at the top of the second to the last page, is, I remember it being very Ditko influenced from the original Ditko lizard appearance. I was all through it. I was trying to. The one character I was really trying to capture the original Ditko on was Kurt Connors, because I pulled out whatever reference I had from that original lizard appearance, and I remember that shot, that final elated shot of Kurt at the end of that transformation as being almost a lift. It might even be a lift from the original Lizard story when he was originally cured the first time. I'm not sure of that, but it strikes me as being, very Ditko, as I remember. But the one thing I wanted to point out before before we moved off this issue was that what I screwed up on Batwing was that, Pat had the shock of hair hanging down into his eyes and on the sides of his face and everything. And because of the way he had the hair hanging, if you look at the original Batwing stories in the compilations and everything, what I screwed up was Batwing his brow moves up into his ears. His brow pulls off and kind of becomes his ears. And even Pat, at times, from different angles, it didn't look like the brow was connecting to the ears as much. And I felt bad because the reference shots I was looking at that didn't seem to illustrate that as clearly were the ones that I apparently was using the most as reference. And when I went back and looked at other appearances when we were going to do Batwing as an adult in Spider-Girl, I realized, I lost that completely. So I was able to bring it back and use it a little more as part of the design of the adult Batwing. So that was something I wanted to point out that Uncle Ron kind of what are you going to do?
It's funny.
They can't all be home runs.
As you mentioned it, so I did check Amazing Spider-Man 6, and I guess maybe this is a bit of a lift. That last shot of Kurt Connors is very similar to the one that you do. It's definitely inspired, that's for sure.
Hey.
Interesting.
Well, if you say so.
You don't think it's... I find it interesting.
At some point, Ron Frenz doing a lift.
Well, not even a lift. A lift.
It's interesting because I rely on them as, they're... In the early days of Marvel, well, there's two things. Wally Wood's, apocryphal commentary that never draw what you can copy, never copy what you can trace, and never trace what you can cut out and paste down was supposedly, like I said, it may be apocryphal, but supposedly it's something that it was Wally Wood's philosophy. And when I was reading early Marvel comics, not, of course, as they were originally coming out, but in reprint, when Joe Sinnott was doing pencils and inks on early Thor stories, you could tell he had the Kirby stories that preceded him in front of him. And he would occasionally do lists for consistency of how Thor did things and how Thor stood and how Thor flew and things like that. And I've always been a proponent of that. I think more of us should do that for consistency in the characters so that everything doesn't become a game of telephone where we're so busy doing our version of a given character that we lose the intrinsic business of the character. It's like when I was doing Spider-Man and Kid Who Collects Spider-Man, it was important to me since he wasn't in action and he wasn't doing Spider-Y Man stuff. It was important to me that just sitting there or standing there, that he be Spider-Man, not just an action figure in the Spider-Man costume. So that's why I went to early Ditko, to look at the early issues of Spider-Man as Steve Ditko himself was evolving the character and finding the character. And there was a certain way he stood and there was a certain way that he interacted and that I wanted to bring into that story. And that meant at the time being one of the early proponents of doing the Ditko webbing, some of the reverse webbing, and not being consistent with what direction the webbing was pointing from shot to shot, because Ditko didn't care about that. That wasn't the consistency and detail to that point of retentiveness was not Ditko's agenda. And I always appreciated that about Ditko's Spider-Man, because it made it creepy and interesting and specific to that character. So I remember, this being pre-McFarlane, there was some concern from the editor, Danny Fingerroth, about it. He debated within himself, but at his editorial discretion, he debated whether or not to have it corrected, whether or not to have Terry Austin correct, quote unquote, some of the webbing to the Romita standard. And I asked him not to. I said, if I'm getting a vote, I vote not to. But you bow to the editorial edict. And to his credit, with no precedent, he said he asked Mr. Austin to ink it the way I penciled it, and he did, and I thought it worked incredibly well in homaging and recalling Mr. Ditko's original vibe of the character. So,
see, I find this very interesting.
Okay, I'm glad. I hope your listeners will as well.
Question about the last page of the issue. You have Commanda, who hasn't technically appeared yet. Was this the Pat design of the character, and then you drew the first appearance, or how did this go?
No, Pat had already designed the character, and the whole purpose of that page was to keep her in shadow and not give her away, not do a big "this is my costume" shot, as Tom DeFalco would refer to them. So it was all fine. But I was working off of her reference that Pat had possibly even already penciled the cover of the next issue, that kind of thing, and I had access to it. So I was definitely working from reference, even though she's in heavy shadow, and Pat was there to say, yeah, that works, for how she was using her little modules and all that kind of stuff. So that was all under strict supervision, let's say.
So a question, just in terms of framing the differences between, this issue with the Lizard and then the last issue of the series, which is when you come back and do another issue, you have two different inkers. So you got Breeding doing is over your pencils when you're doing the Lizard story. But now when you do the last issue, I believe, now I'm blanking on his name. Is it McLeod? Yeah.
Yeah, the inker on that was Bob McLeod, and it was more finishing. The one thing I do remember specifically is I don't know whether it was because of the deadline or what, but I do know that my work on that issue, the second issue, was much more breakdowns. It was much more open. I still was responsible for all the storytelling, but I know my breakdowns were a lot looser for that than they were for the Lizard story, probably because of the time element in turning them around. But which was fine, because Bob McLeod is much more of a finisher. Being a penciler himself, he brings much more of himself to the project, no matter what the penciler has provided. He did the third issue of Hobgoblin Lives, which was tighter pencils for me than this issue of Untold Tales we're about to discuss. But he still brings as much of himself to it, because he is a penciler in his own right, and editors are okay with that, and as they should be. Everybody should be doing their best and contributing the most they can to make the project as good as possible. So I don't begrudge anybody that, and Bob is a finisher by nature. In my experience working with him, he can't help himself. I mean, that's just what he does. Tom Palmer was very much the same way. If Tom changed something more overtly from the pencils, and you asked him about it, and again you respectfully asked him about it, quite often he was completely unaware of it.
Interesting.
His mindset as he was doing anything, inking or finishing, everything to him was finishing, and he would tend to express surprise that he really went off the pencil line because he was doing it the way he saw it to be done. When I was doing breakdowns on Star Wars, I had my own, cartoonalized version of the cast, and quite often, it clashed with what Mr. Palmer had been doing for years before I showed up. He had his own cartoonalized versions of who these characters were and what they looked like. Some of it you can see on my Facebook page when I post the pencils of Star Wars covers with the finishes and stuff, and other times it's not as obvious. I remember when we were sharing studio space, Pat penciled a Dracula miniseries, and he was thrilled because it was going to be inked by Tom Palmer. But what he didn't anticipate, and which happened once or twice, and again, it's one of these things that if you're going to be a mature adult working in comics, you're going to recognize the collaborative nature of the business, and you're going to, have to appreciate what the other person is bringing to it. Now, I don't remember whether Pat was being paid breakdowns or paid full pencils. I believe he was being paid full pencils. And he was doing what he felt was a accurate take on the Palmer Dracula. Tom Palmer had a different take. But what Tom thought he was doing was recreating what he did with Gene Colan. And, for Pat, it became one of these situations where, okay, I'm not going to work as hard on every single Dracula face trying to give them what I think Colan, Palmer, Dracula looked like if Tom Palmer's not agreeing with me, which is the same conclusion I came to with the Star Wars characters. I wasn't going to angst over photo reference on every shot of Luke Skywalker or Han Solo or Princess Leia because Tom had his own, thinking on what these characters looked like and wasn't giving a lot of thought to, I need to fix this, but he was doing what he had been doing over Walt Simonson for years on those characters. And, if you're not able or willing to recognize that and be okay with it, then you don't really belong doing professional collaborative comics. I'm not going to speak for Pat, but Pat also now inks himself on pretty much every project.
Yeah.
Whether that has anything to do with any of his past interactions with other inkers, I cannot say. I would be unwilling to say because Pat was a total pro when it came to these kinds of things. But for somebody like me, Pat can ink himself if he has the time and the inclination on any given project. I am not trained with the inking tools. I'm certainly not trained with the digital tools. I'm only now really getting comfortable with the inking discipline on my commissions. So I got into this business wanting to be a storyteller and a penciler and knowing that part of that was working with inkers. And I have been lucky enough to work with some of the best in the business. From Joe Sinnott to Tom Palmer to Klaus Janson to Brett Breeding to Joe Rubenstein, on and on and on. The best in the business. I have been incredibly fortunate with the people I've worked with. And every single one of them requires a recognition of, the collaborative nature of the business. Mm-hmm. And if you don't, then you're going to be branded a prima donna real quick because you're going to rant and rave every time somebody doesn't ink a line exactly the way you laid it down in pencil. Then you're the jerk. Let's put it that way.
So when you look at an issue like this, then, where, as you said, you did more breakdowns, I'm very curious what that's like for you to look at your own work and have there being more of an interpretation by someone else than is sometimes possible because, often you do tighter pencils, but this was a more of a breakdown kind of job. So what is it like for you to kind of look at it, or even just to remember it? You don't have it right in front of you, but to remember an issue like that and remember when it came out? Because I guess it's very different what you kind of put in this instance, and then seeing the finished product even more so than normal because more liberties may or may not have been made.
Well, the mindset you need to be in is that, one, the buying public, the reading public, is not aware of what your contribution was specifically, okay? Mm-hmm. So if you're going to say, oh, he lost that face, he lost that expression, the expression is a thing because that's part of the storytelling. So you can mention to an inker, if you have a one-on-one interaction with him, that you kind of lost that expression. Could be more careful next time. Or you can mention it to your editor to have the editor be the go-between in a situation like that, if it affects storytelling. But if you're just, your concern has to be what is presented to the readership, and the final product is what matters. And the anchor is always going to have the final word on that product. So when I look at that issue of Untold Tales of Spider-Man, or any time I've worked with Bob McLeod, then I'm just saying, okay, as a final product, how do I feel about being a part of this? How do I feel about being a contributor to this final product? And this final product is good, is really good. I'm happy to have my name on it. And it's not like I'm going to travel door to door to everybody that bought a copy and said, but see, I had placed the blacks on this figure differently, and he went his own way with it, because objectively, nobody cares. That's all subjective, What he did might be different from what I did. It might not be the way I would have done it, but the bottom line is, that doesn't affect the storytelling. That doesn't affect the product in any negative way. That's a zero-sum argument, because the readers don't know and don't care, really, what you did or what he did differently, because they get to see what he did, and what he did is fine. It's every bit as legitimate as what I did. So you have to, your creative ego in a collaborative process like this has to be put on hold. At best, it's over beers with your buddies. It's not something that you air in public or have any right to air in public, because the final product is as good as it could be. Mm-hmm. That make any sense?
It does. No, absolutely. One thing I wanted to ask about, because the issue... I don't know if Kurt was trying to do something a little bit different, because there's a moment in particular where there's a little bit more like slapstick than you usually see in a Spider-Man comic, but it's very funny and it does work, where Jameson has already been punched by, not punched, but was taken out by Norman Osborn earlier in the issue, so he's kind of coming to, he's kind of out of it, he's groggy, he goes towards an open door to try to get out of this like storeroom that he's in, someone runs by, slams the door in his face, and he kind of falls to the ground. It's a funny moment, and then 2 pages later, you do the same thing. You do the exact same gag. It's basically a reason to keep Jameson off the panel, but he gets another door in the face. It's very funny. It's a very fun slapstick thing, which is again not typical of a Spider-Man book per se. I'm curious how you took that as an artistic challenge of making it still work, and I don't know if you lifted yourself and did the exact same image, because it looks almost identical, this kind of shot of Jameson kind of falling off to the ground after being smacked in the face, but I'm just curious how you approach a moment of levity like that, because you're not used to doing gags per se, but that's what this is.
Well, it is a gag, and my training for such things came from working with the fantastic writer Joe Duffy on Star Wars. We had such fun in every issue. Some issues more than others. Some of our issues were very serious and very dramatic, but other issues were out and out humorous slapstick. And that was always great fun to me, and she was a great teacher of such things, and I always enjoyed doing those shticks with Joe. So I kind of had to, 2 years of Star Wars as training for that kind of bit, and I was not intimidated by it at all. And you're right, at times, the thing that works best for sequences like that is repetitiveness, is repeating the sequence almost verbatim to show that that's exactly what is happening. It's happening exactly the same way again. And our job as visual storytellers is to make that as obvious as possible. I mean, I've often said it's not rocket science to tell a clear visual story. You just have to get out of your own way and stop trying to be clever all the time and tell the story as obviously, visually as possible. Mm-hmm. And that has always kind of been my North Star when it comes to such things. So yeah, I don't remember it slowing me down or going, oh, this is a very different challenge than I'm used to, because I had some experience with it. And if it's part of the story, you find the most obvious way to portray it visually. So, that's the best answer I can give you, sir.
Did you know, I mean, again, because you're guest starting artist on this, but did you know this was the last issue? Like, would that have been told to you, or were you just kind of like, we need to do for another issue?
I think I was aware that they were wrapping it up. Now, if I remember correctly, this was plotted by Kurt, but scripted by Roger Stern, correct?
Oh, I have to double check that. I don't know if I realized that or clocked it.
You have it in front of you?
I do. I'm just pulling it up. So I don't think I realized that. It's just, this is scintillating audio as I check.
A little traveling music, maestro.
Yeah. Oh, you're right. Yeah. Kurt Busiek script and co-plotter Roger Stern. Okay. Interesting. Or actually, it's unclear who. It's unclear who did each. It's unclear who did what, actually.
Yeah. There might have been a looser plot or a pitch from Kurt. I'm not quite sure what Roger had to work with. But there was some very loose talk at the time of the strip continuing with Roger Stern and me.
Oh.
It didn't happen, obviously. I was never approached about it. I was never offered the gig or anything. I don't know what the conversations were with Roger. But, obviously it didn't happen. Unfortunately, the problem that this book kept running into, completely divorced from the quality of the work or the storytelling or the concept or anything. One of the problems they had was it was a 99-cent book that people mischaracterized without ever reading the book. The people that read the book were huge fans of the book. To this day, there are people who will tell you that it was the best Spider-Man material being produced during this time because what was going on in the regular titles was the Clone Saga, which went on too long and was convoluted and terribly paced, and this was Spider-Man, and blah, 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 blah. But, unfortunately, a lot of people bypassed the title because they thought it was either a reprint title or some watered-down version of Spider-Man for kids, because they knew he was a teenager again in it. And this was before Marvel was launching the occasional Spidey title or something like they did within the last 10 years. It was miscategorized as being, because it was 99 cents, it must not have been valuable or good. And that, of course, was ludicrous given the talent involved and the effort involved and the storytelling involved and the art involved. It was just, it was sad and ridiculous. There was some talk about, taking Untold Tales and making it a full-priced book and trying to give it an effort to re-engage it with the public as a full-price book and everything. And those conversations never went very far, and it was just literally one of the many damn shames that happened in the publishing era from time to time. It just was.
It's funny though, because the price point was to help get it into the bigger box stores and do it as these collections, etc. But then that same price point ends up scaring people who actually would have maybe kept it going.
It was odd how they reacted to it. It really, truly was, and a lot of it was people who never cracked the cover to read it. But that's the big problem. I mean, it's a huge problem in this country. The impact that the uninformed part of the public can have on everybody else. It just is. And that's an example of it. The MC2 line was another example of it. I had conversations with people, the Spider-Girl fans that there are some of the most loyal fans you're ever going to meet of any property. Okay? You know this. But I would talk to people at conventions where they would saying, I loved what you and DeFalco did with Hobgoblin. I said, really? Well, here, we're bringing Hobgoblin into the Spider-Girl continuity. And they would say, well, that's not real, right? That's not real continuity. I said, okay, we're going to have a problem in this conversation. I said, you said you enjoyed what Tom DeFalco and I did with the Hobgoblin character. I'm telling you that if you go and buy the current issues of Spider-Girl, you will have Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz doing new stories about the Hobgoblin. If your decision to read those stories is made based on what is real continuity and what is not real continuity, then I can't help you. And, it's been nice talking with you. That kind of thing. But I had more than one conversation like that with fans at conventions.
Yeah.
So, again, I really don't know how to quantify any of that now.
We're a very funny bunch, comic book fans, because
they can be, and they feel the way they feel about their continuity and their consistency, and whether or not they're interested in reading about alternate futures or alternate pasts or what-if stories or whatever. There's as many different approaches to how they're going to deal with that as there are fans out there dealing with it. So.
Absolutely. Now, I want to, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm actually over what I have allotted, actually. I'm past my expiration date at this point, but I want to thank you once again for coming back and really getting into this stuff and giving me insights into how you approach characters and how you approach storylines and storytelling, because it's always an education to be able to talk to you about these books that I have loved for years and being able to get a greater appreciation of the art within.
Well, as I've said before, and I'll repeat it briefly now, Adam, it is always a pleasure to speak to somebody who sometimes is giving us more credit than we deserve in the thought that is given to some of this, because there is, quite honestly, an idea of the fact that we're working on a deadline, and sometimes we just have to produce this stuff and worry about making it perfect next month, and we're always striving for that perfection. But the fact that you have such a critical eye and are looking at this material with that critical eye, and that it's sometimes, and more often than not, surviving that critical eye, and you're still able to enjoy it and appreciate it, is something that any creative who puts some heart and soul and love and sweat into these projects appreciates. Believe me, we appreciate it when it's looked at that closely and considered that closely. I appreciate your opinions and I appreciate your insights.
Absolutely.
So, thank you.
Again, thank you so much. Now, at some point, I'm going to have you come back to talk about your Hercules miniseries, but
I would love to do that. That was one of my favorite projects.
Well, I'm even more excited to talk about it at some point. It's actually it's finally in like a reprint or collected version, because it was in the Thor Epic Collection that covers the Journey into Mystery period. And so for whatever reason, they put your Hercules in that book.
No kidding.
So it's
I
now.
wonder if I'll get a free copy of it. When did that come out, sir?
I want to say in the last couple of months. It just happened.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I'll still get a free copy of it. But do you know what number of the Epic Collection it was offhand?
Oh, that is a good question. Give me 2 seconds. Let's play some elevator music as I look this up.
Okay.
And because I will find that for you. Let's see here. There we go. There's some music. All right. So Thor Epic Collection. Let's see. It is nice having your entire run on Thor proper in those collections. I would say just having it on my bookshelf is nice to have it all together.
Well, they did send me comp copies, or at least one comp copy of each of those, so I have that on my shelf too. That's pretty cool. And they did the Amazing Spider-Girl run in a series of trades, and they collected the Spectacular stuff and everything. So I do have a lot of. They just did They're doing our Spider-Man. Well, they just completed our Spider-Man run in the Marvel Masterworks.
That's
so
right,
that was very gratifying. So yeah, it's been interesting. Still getting checks on work I did all those years ago, but. Based on sales, so it's an interesting time, no doubt about it.
So it looks like it's Thor Epic Collection number 24, The Lost Gods, which actually just came out June 4th, so it's less than a month old.
Oh, yeah. So that's still very much pending.
And you got Hercules and the Heart of Chaos, 1 to 3.
And that means it also, it sounds like by the title that it collects the miniseries that Tom DeFalco did, with the Deodata Studios and wrapped up by Sal Buscema, too, the Lost Gods miniseries.
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
sounds like it. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. That Hercules series was done during the period of time that they were doing Heroes Reborn, and it dealt directly with the fact that the Avengers and Fantastic Four had been removed from the 616, and S.H.I.E.L.D. was trying to maximize the super people that were left. So we used that as a launching pad for the entire plot concept. But yeah, I look forward to it.
we'll get into that next time. I
Let me know. Okay?
Absolutely. Yeah. Next time we're definitely going to delve into that.
Okay. Thank you very much for these terrific conversations. I appreciate it, Adam.
I appreciate it as well. Thank you so much, Ron.
You bet.